things have really changed since when I was a kid. We didn't have the cell phones, and so if someone took 27 pictures of themselves every 30 minutes, we would think they were crazy. But now they care so much about likes and who care. They don't care about them, but I don't know how to battle that because I don't understand it. I don't care if people like me or not, I'm me, and that's it. That's part of my self actualization journey. But that doesn't relate well to a small child. So, what's your advice there?
Yeah, look, um, I think for me, this for me this boils down to at its fundamental level, and I'm giving you a long game answer as opposed to a short term answer because I think that's where something like this sits. Um, for me, this is what this first principle of spirituality about identity, I think is super important. I just cannot overestimate this because what happens is in today's kind of world of all the things that they are exposed to, as you kind of mentioned there, there is such a pressure as to what is it that I am identifying with, and who am I identifying with. So there's all the identifications I have. So my my ethnic identity, my gender identity, my family identity, my, you know, all the identities that we have. Then it's my mental identities. I am a good, sports person. I am good at math. I am bad at English. All of those, I'm a kind person. I'm not a courageous, all of those mental identifications. And then, and so you got the bodily identification, you got the mental identification, you got social identifications. What group am I part of? Who are my friends? What's my, for adults, like what's my political affiliate? All of those kind of identifications, right? So you got all of these like unlimited layers of identification. And then it's, when you think about it from that perspective, it's not such a surprise that you get into this kind of habit of responding to things like, the need of social media to take whatever pictures, and because it's related to identity, it's related to who am I and how am I expressing myself. And that conversation with children, which is what we try and do in the schools, is about kind of saying, okay, we have these identities. It's not like we're saying, throw them all out. But what we are saying is that, are they the most fundamental to you? Are they your most fundamental identity? And and then learning to, how is it that we can start to peel back the layers of identity to get to something which is for you and your child like really profound, to say, this is where I want to be in terms of my identity, this is what I want to be identified with, and this is where I, and once you get to that layer, then what happens is the perspective changes. Now all of a sudden it's not so important for me to be constantly reliant on external validation, because all of these other identities rely on external validation. Now what I'm interested in is, what is what is my own self-validation, and what is a validation by those who love me and who I love. And I think, like I said, the warning on the answer was, or the response rather, was that this is a long game. It really is a long game, but it, personally, I don't think there are some quick fixes to this. I think it's about the conversation about identity and really helping them think that through for themselves.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Sure.
Okay. So you talked about spend more time in the conversation, uh, especially in the teen years when children are involved in a lot of sports or any activity at the high school level. It becomes very hard to get them. First of all, in my mind, I have heard teenagers don't want to talk about it with you. So, how do you get around and make that a possibility?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's, yeah, that's an interesting one, and I think many parents face that. I think in teenage years, many children will want to spend more time with their peers. They will want to have the conversation with peers as opposed to their default previously, which was with parents, right? So I think uh, I think it's a big challenge. I would say a couple of things. Um, a lot of that foundation building is done early on. So it's about habit forming. If you're past that age with the kids and those habits have already been formed or not been formed, and for good reason, right? They've got so much other engagement that it's hard uh, to really engage them with lots of time. Then going back to my earlier point, I think time is always going to be a constraint. It may even be a constraint for us because we may be working parents and therefore we don't have the time, even when they're younger, to spend huge amounts of time with them. But in those situations, really, the important thing I think is, I know it's cliche, but it's true, is that it is the quality that will trump the quantity. It is the quality of that conversation. And I, unfortunately, what happens is when children and adolescents do try and approach their parents, often what happens is at that moment, the parent may not be available. And even if they are technically available, they may be distracted. And if a child, particularly when they want to say something, senses that the parent's not engaged, they will back off quite easily. So it's important, really, I think, to invest in the time that we do have with as much consciousness as we can bring to bear, so that they feel really heard and being and understand that we value the conversation, um, and uh, that hopefully will open the door more to them engaging in it, because I think it is too easy just to to not place as much importance on it, particularly when it seems to us trivial. It may not be trivial to them. I can see hands, but I would suggest that maybe
Yeah,
you could just unmute. Yeah, thank you.
yeah. Hi. So I
Hi.
have a question actually. So this is like we are not able to solve this question. So story behind it. So my daughter has a best friend, and they have some conflict. And best friend parents to call me and said, okay, tell your daughter don't play with her. And she's like 6 year old. She's emotional, and I miss we explain, okay, but it's I think it's emotion already attract, right? So I think currently as an elder we think logically, but kids are emotionals. They think more emotionally. So I don't know how to uh, teach or tell my daughter why she should not play, because I don't have objection, but I think this is what I have to do because the parents asking me to do.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think that's a really tough one because, um, you know, there is there's you're not just dealing with children there. I think as I say this to the parents of our schools. Dealing with the kids is easy. Dealing with the parents, that's harder. So sometimes it's not always a rational reason. Sometimes there may be reasons why there may be a temporary kind of suspension or whatever of that interaction. But generally, kids don't see it that way. I'm just sorry. While you were speaking, I was thinking about, I can't remember the name of the film, but there was a film where you've got two sets of parents, and the whole film is basically shot in the living room, where the kids of these parents have had a fight outside of the somewhere, and these two sets of parents have come together, and the whole film is about their conversation and argument. If anyone in the chat remembers what that film is, please put it in the chat box. But it was so insightful, because it was actually the way that things work, where a lot of the issue often is at the adult level as opposed to the child level. And I think one of the important things for us, even if that's not the case, even if there's a genuine altercation there between the kids, is how are we teaching and modeling to our children to deal with conflict? So there are many ways that we can deal with conflict. And sometimes the default is essentially to kind of either distance or react and uh, uh, defend or attack kind of responses. Um, and that's not to say that none of these are necessary any of the time, but if that's our default position, or if that's our first place that we go to, um, that's not great. So I think it may be a conversation with parents at a first level. I would suggest to really see whether that is the best way forward and whether there is a more um, amenable way forward. Okay, I can see uh, another hand. So who's that? Toshin?
Yeah, that would be me. Thank you so much for your presentation. The biggest takeaway for me is the power of conversations, right?
Hmm.
And I know I was born and raised in Nigeria. I grew up in Africa, and we have all these amazing stories. My grandmother used to tell me about the tortoise and the lion and things like that.
Yeah,
And I find that my kids really love those stories, right? They
yeah.
they ask me if I'm walking them to school, Mommy, do you have another story for me? So I'm wondering if you have recommendations around what those conversations should look like. And secondly, if you have like coaching stories that you recommend to people listening to you today.
Yeah, okay. Sojin, sorry, the audio cut up. I didn't hear the first question. I got the second question about the stories. What was the first one, please?
Uh, so when we do have those conversations with our kids, what do we talk about? Can you unpack that
Ah,
a little bit?
yeah, yeah. Okay, fine. Um, yeah. Well, I honestly, I actually don't even. Well, I'll say two things. One is that the content may not be the the primary focus in the beginning. So it may be whatever they want to talk about, right? So, but you're guiding that conversation in a way that really gets to the heart of the matter, as opposed to just skimming the surface of stuff. Like, what did you do to school today? And it kind of stops at like a very superficial level. So to be able to model to them to have how to have meaningful deep conversations, and I think adults are often not great at this, so it's practice for us too, right? Like how to have those conversations. So one is that the content may not be the primary thing, but the second thing is, if we do talk about content as a primary thing, then I would say that what is it that gets to the essence of stuff in a way that speaks to fundamental truths? Like you mentioned the stories that I forget, your mother or your grandmother was telling you about, whether it's the lion or, these are these stories are not it's not necessarily the plot in itself which is the most fundamental thing. It's what it represents, right? What is that almost prototypical character and image of a character meaning for my life? And so you're talking about really fundamental, profound things. They're not, and this is the point around spirituality being a buffer to materialism, because often our conversations could be so superficial and so like transitory and not really mean anything beyond the purely mundane. And if we can't go beyond that, then we're also trained, like we're also fostering their inability to go beyond that. So I think get to at the beginning, get to the point of where conversation is important and it matters and you're engaged, and then move the conversation on to things which are fundamental and important and really important to you and to them. And in terms of things which I would point to, interesting actually, because we're just about to, you make this point, because we're just about to publish uh, a something called the Avanti Stories, which are a compilation of um, wisdom tales from around the world, which bring out and can act as prompts for conversation. So what we're saying, different age groups will manage it differently, but what we're saying to the lower years is to say, you can just read your child this story at home, and it will prompt you into different questions and conversations which will take you beyond the purely material and mundane. And again, it's all in an endeavor to try and support um, one's own spiritual exploration and having good conversations. So yeah, maybe what I'll do is I'll get back to via Sapna once that's available for wider viewing, and share that more widely. But thank you for the
Thank you.
question.
I'll definitely buy a copy. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so Sapna, I don't see any hand. I don't know if I'm missing them, but I'll hand back to you.
Okay, I think like I we had like couple of in the beginning.
Mhm.
I'll just go over how best to explain to a child that the rules are different for adults.
Yeah, well, this is a not a straightforward one. I think what the approach I took, which did work for me, was that wherever it wasn't essential or important, wherever it wasn't necessary for there to be a distinction, the smartphone example was a good example, I think. So I needed my smartphone for work, and I didn't feel that my child needed it at the age that they were for the use as an emergency phone, which is why they were having the phone. So um, there was a distinction there, and obviously the response was, well, why is that? So what I found was when I took the time to explain exactly why there was a difference. I took the time to explain why there's a difference and why um, my role as a parent is different to their role as a child. So I'm not trying to say, and that's why, going back to Chanakya's point, right? You're a friend after 15. You're not a friend between five. Well, not to say that you're not a friend at all, but your primary emphasis is not around friendship and equality, because friendship implies a certain level of equality, right? Whereas between 5 and 15, there is a sense of I am the person who is the elder person, the person who's supposed to be here to kind of protect and in your best interest guide you, etc. And that involves a level of discipline and differentiation and distinction. But if they see, and kids get this real young, like I think often adults underestimate the ability of children to rationalize stuff. They understand that in instances where it's really necessary and when you're not doing it all of the time, they can see that difference. And when you can explain it to them and have the conversation with them, they get it. So it's not always easy, it's not always straightforward, but I do think it's the only way to really progress in that conversation, because you'll not always be the same and have the same, and that's unrealistic. But to be honest and be clear and to be consistent in how you're engaging with that, that's really important.
Okay, thank you. I think like we have a raised hand
Hmm.
by Rashmi. Yeah, Rashmi, please go ahead.
Yeah, I feel I'm trying to be more, I want to be more authoritative because my daughter is around 7 to 8. But I feel I'm getting into nagging mode more than, authoritative mode, and it's on me to change, but I don't know how to change. And what are your suggestions on that?
Yeah, thank you for being so honest. I think, I think we all go through that at some point, probably. I certainly did. I think that, you know, it's not, it's not, it's not completely unnatural, right? So we, we, we want the best for our children. And when we see that there is something that they could be doing, um, that we want to keep pushing that point because we think, this is good for you, this is your best interest, you'll thank me later, etc., etc. And we keep, as you say, nagging. That's what we end up doing. But remember the point I made about keeping the big picture in mind. And often what we end up doing is we nag about small stuff. And even if we're nagging about big stuff, that's not necessarily the thing that's going to get you to where you want to be. So, um, that's it's an interesting problem for us because uh, like we don't if we want to if we keep the end goal in mind, we can remind ourselves as to, okay, I don't need to push every point, and me pushing every point is not necessarily going to get me the result I want to get to anyway. So I think that's an important thing for us to bear in mind. But honestly, I think the other thing is, these 4 points around spirituality, that's for adults too. Like if we engage in practices that do raise our level of consciousness for ourselves, whatever, it's part of a spiritual journey, if you want to call it that, to understand what is it that helps you raise your level of consciousness. But when you're able to raise your level of consciousness in these ways and it can take years, right, to develop and to grow in this way, but it will help you manage your own emotions and reactions to these types of things. And I like the comment by Jolene there. Oh, right, she's quoting somebody. If you've said something 100 times and your child is not getting it, doing it, who is a slow learner? So yeah, very true. The only thing, the only caveat I'd add to that is that it may be that there's a reason why they're not doing it, right? It may be there may be a good reason why they're not doing it or getting it, and it may be um, it may be multifold. So yeah, let's bear in mind the kind of the long game and the big picture here before we get into default, because the fact is that we have to be careful about how many times we call on that nagging card, because as we've seen, it loses effect at a certain point. So you want to save those for when it's really really important. Um,
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
So can we take like one last question?
Yeah, sure, sure.
Okay, so Kumar Swami, please go
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah. So I have two daughters of a age difference of 3.5 years. So one is younger one is 4.5, and when we take care of her more, I think elder one is getting disturbed. So how to deal with this jealous, and because more discipline is needed for elder one. She asked the question why only for me and why is not, and she's enjoying. I am not. So how to deal with this situation, sir?
Yeah, I again one that's familiar to me. I when we experienced that, one of the things that we did was again I'll go back to conversation. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I do believe in it so much. Um, is is to explain to that child um, is about the stages of development. So, I, when you were that age, we didn't treat you any differently. And we are going through the same phase with that child. And when that child is your age, we won't treat them differently in the sense of whether it's rules or discipline or expectations in terms of behavior. So just helping them understand really. And sometimes what happens is we can say something and we think we've explained it, but sometimes the child needs to hear it in different ways, explained in different ways, and exemplified, and for them to really be able to appreciate it, and for them to be able to understand it for themselves, as opposed to just us speaking theoretically. And where they see that not being essential or necessary, or not being within the parameters of what needs to be different from one child to another, and that being that kind of level of consistency, that will also enforce in them this sense that, okay, it's not a blanket thing, that I'm just less loved, if you like, than this younger child. And I do remember that we were also conscious that that may arise. So we did make sure that we spent quality time and attention to the older child, so that they didn't feel that or felt it less in terms of, why is the attention always all of a sudden gone to this new kid on the block, kind of thing. So yeah, it's a tough one, but I think a combination of those two things. One is reinforcing the messaging about stages and how it's consistent across both. And the second one about actually spending quality one-to-one time, or at least two-to-one time with the older sibling, where when possible and practical, so that they do feel that I haven't just lost my parents to this new kid.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Thank you. I'll just read one comment by Urvi. Would love to connect with you and talk more about how to walk through a teen on identity and layers of identity, and many more comments. But yeah,
Yeah,
thank you. Thank you so much. So, on behalf of our extend team, we would like to convey our heartfelt appreciation to our guest speaker for a truly, truly exceptional talk. And I really appreciate your insights and wisdom have left a long-lasting impression on all of us. And we are grateful for the time you have spent with us today.